The Tzimisce are well known for their breeding of ghouls, but does anybody ever talk about the ghouls? No, nobody does. They always talk about the Tzimisce. So today we're going to talk about the ghouls and give them a little bit of love because they don't get any love anywhere else. Now I've kind of used the term ghoul and revenant a little interchangeably, but that's not correct. They are independent, separate things. Ghouls are made by vampires, but revenants are bred. And as a process of this, revenants have families. And there were roughly 24 lines of families when it comes to the revenants. The bulk of these were serving the Tzimisce, but revenants were also used and served other clans. Of the 24 total revenant families that were in existence, 14 of them served the Tzimisce, the other 10 were spread amongst a couple of other vampire clans. Revenants are an evolution of ghouls, but how do you get a ghoul in the first place? If you were to feed any living creature a tiny amount of vampire blood or vitae, it would be considered a ghoul. And in Vampire the Masquerade, ghouls are ever-present servants of different vampires and the different vampire clans. Obviously, it's very easy to create a ghoul, and it's very easy to take advantage of a ghoul, especially if you're a vampire. They are very often mistreated. And depending on how much vitae is running through the ghoul's veins, their emotions can reach some pretty intense extremes. When you combine this with the blood bond that they experience with their creators or their masters, I suppose, it's no wonder that the name ghouls was chosen for them. Now, revenants are ghouls, but they are ghouls who have evolved. The ghoul nature is just part of their birthright, it's hereditary. In short, a revenant is a blend between being immortal and being a vampire. Some other vampires take the stance that a revenant is a corruption of a mortal with the curse of Cain. Either way you look at it, revenants are more than human but not quite vampire, and they share qualities between the two. Revenants are able to drink vampire vitae, but they don't need to because they also produce their own blood, which contains trace amounts of vampire vitae. Revenants also don't age the same way as mortals. They do age. It is possible for a revenant to die of old age. It's unlikely because of how mistreated they are, but the vampire vitae running through their veins, it prevents the aging process, or at least slows it down. A revenant who is 100 years old may only appear to be in their 20s. And unlike vampires who are undead creatures, revenants and ghouls, they are alive. A revenant needs to eat, they hunger, they thirst, they need to sleep, and they are able to reproduce, which is obviously how we get revenants. Physically, they are stronger than humans, but they're not as powerful as vampires. Revenants also have access to supernatural abilities coming from the Mark of Cain, and they also have access, or the downsides, of the curses that come from the Mark of Cain. Now, before we talk about how ghouls can become revenants, if you are enjoying today's video, please let me know by hitting the thumbs up button. And if you want to see more World of Darkness content, then please hit subscribe with the bell notification. Now, as I've mentioned, it is possible for ghouls to pass on their inherent traits. In the grand scheme of things, for a vampire, this doesn't take very long, but for mortals, it takes several generations to be able to pass these traits along. And the vampire masters creating these ghouls and trying to produce revenants, they have to be very selective with their breeding process and very specific. But when it's finished, the ghoul will produce its own amount of vitae with that vampiric taint in it. Now, if you didn't know this already, vitae is just a vampire terminology for the blood of vampires. In a vampire, it is not produced, it must be consumed. So another reason for these families to be created was for food consumption, basically. At least in its simplest form. There was definitely other reasons, having spy networks and defenders that could be out during the day. But all of the revenant families that either exist today, have ever existed, they were all bred by vampires over many generations. And it should be stated that revenants, although they contain a trace amount of vampiric vitae in their veins, they cannot use it to form a blood bond. They cannot use it to create other ghouls. They cannot embrace another mortal and create a vampire. This is because although they possess a trace amount of vitae, it's not enough to actually complete that process. It is enough, however, to allow them to use certain disciplines. They can use their vitae to perform abilities or things that vampires would be able to do, like heal themselves. They just can't go out and make other vampires or other ghouls themselves. If you've been a ghoul for a while, or even just a revenant because they've been that all their lives, they struggle with the inner dilemma of the beast inside that's trying to get out. They are subject to the rules of frenzy, as well as something called Rotschreck. Rotschreck is known as the red fear. This is the fear of fire or sunlight. For vampires, just the sight of it can be terror-inducing. Depending on how close the vampire is to the open flame, this can induce terror. It can cause them to flee. They go into a state of frenzy, basically. And vampires even have access to some abilities that can cause this fear to be provoked in other vampires. The original Revenant families were created to serve the Tzimisce, and then later the Spot adopted the practice of using Revenants as well. In the old days, Revenants served an important purpose. Because society was not nearly as connected or interwoven as it is now, Revenants bridged the gap. And in many cases, Revenants were happy to help. Some Revenants viewed the vampires as gods, hoping to achieve a godlike state for themselves, at least at some point. Others resisted the brutal tyranny of their vampire masters and rebelled or ran away. The Tzimisce originally used their Revenant families for candidates for the embrace. They didn't just want to embrace someone right away, they had to make sure that it was a good idea or that certain traits were passed down. This is why they created them. The embrace is the only act of creation that vampires can do. Through the act of draining a target's blood and then infusing a little bit of their own vitae into their victim, this is how vampires are able to pass on the curse of Cain. In modern day settings, known as modern knights in World of Darkness, Revenants are a relic of the past. The Tzimisce have moved on from using Revenants. They still have the families, but they don't make them anymore. At least most of the clan. The hardcore Tzimisce traditionalists, they still maintain families of Revenants and try to create more. The Sabbat also keeps the Revenant families around because they still serve important functions. The Sabbat still has use for them, so they get to continue living. From the Revenant perspective, they are extremely loyal to their creators in most cases. It takes a hell of a lot of mistreatment for a Revenant to become disloyal to their master. And Revenants consider themselves more than human. They look down on humanity. They also view themselves as better than ghouls. And it's this superiority mindset that's kind of ingrained in a lot of Revenants. Although they operate in human society, they don't integrate very well into human society. Many of the Revenant family philosophies and belief systems, they are indoctrinated into the children of these families at a very young age. And because the selective breeding process of Revenants, unfortunately, many of these families are largely inbred as well. Combine that with some of their unusual personality traits, their superiority complex that they have over humans and other ghouls, this hinders their integration into human society. And for humans or mortals looking at Revenants or dealing with Revenants, their ideas are quite far-fetched. They're kind of unpleasant to be around for mortals. A lot of things Revenants do in human society freaks out a lot of other humans. They're just weird and awkward. Now, I have made reference to Cain several times throughout this video. If you are curious as to who Cain was, the OG vampire, please click on the video on your screen now. I would like to thank all of my patrons who support me and the channel. The May video votes are out for my patron supporters, and my first custom bit of content is out for my $15 supporters as well. My name's Nathaniel. Thanks for stopping by, everyone.